What would you do if someone from your own neighborhood cut the lock off your car, claiming it didn't belong there, only to find out that car was being watched by the police the entire time? It began on a quiet morning in Brookhaven Estates, a peaceful condo community just outside St. Petersburg, Florida. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops. The air was still cool, carrying that faint ocean scent mixed with freshly cut grass. Most residents were still inside, brewing coffee or scrolling through morning news, unaware that something was about to shatter the calm. At the far end of the parking lot, where the oak trees threw long shadows across the asphalt, a woman crouched beside a charcoal-gray Jeep. Her name was Marjorie Keller, vice president of the Brookhaven Homeowners Association. At 57, she carried herself with the stiff confidence of someone who believed she was always right. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her lips pressed tight, her posture straight, even as she gripped a pair of heavy bolt cutters. The sound came first, a metallic grind, sharp and echoing, steel biting steel. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in a quiet community like this. Marjorie pressed harder, her hands trembling with the effort. With a loud snap, the lock fell to the pavement. She exhaled sharply, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "There," she muttered under her breath. Problem solved. No more eyesore in this lot. But Marjorie wasn't alone. Across the lot, two men leaned against an old silver sedan. They had been watching quietly for hours, their eyes trained on that same Jeep. They weren't neighbors. They weren't maintenance workers. They were part of a multi-agency police task force, staking out the vehicle for an ongoing operation. And now, the very car they were monitoring had just been tampered with by an HOA officer with bolt cutters. "Ma'am, put that tool down," one of the men barked, stepping forward. Marjorie froze. She looked up, startled. "Excuse me? Who do you think you're talking to? This is private property. I'm on the board here." The taller man flashed a badge, quick but unmistakable. The moment it caught the morning light, her expression shifted. Surprise gave way to confusion, then indignation. "What is this about?" she demanded. The second officer approached slowly, his tone firm. "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am, now." For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the faint hum of an air conditioner nearby. Then, one by one, doors began opening across the lot. Neighbors stepped out, coffee mugs in hand, slippers scuffing the concrete. They squinted toward the commotion, curious, confused, intrigued, and then came a voice that broke the silence. "What's going on here?" It was David Carter, the Jeep's owner. He stood at the edge of the parking lot, keys dangling in one hand, his uniform shirt tucked neatly into his work pants. He'd been heading out for his morning shift when he saw the crowd forming, and the sight before him made his stomach drop. His Jeep, his lock, and Marjorie Keller standing there with bolt cutters like she'd just caught a criminal. David's voice was calm, but the edge in it was clear. "Tell me you didn't just cut my lock." Marjorie turned, clutching the cutters tightly as though they were her shield. "This vehicle's been parked here for days without moving. We can't have suspicious cars cluttering the lot. I was doing my job." David blinked in disbelief. "Your job? You've seen me drive this Jeep every day for years. You knew it was mine." The officers exchanged glances but said nothing, not yet. They had rules about revealing details of an active operation. Still, their silence said plenty. A few neighbors whispered from the sidelines. "She really did it this time," one muttered. Another shook his head. "Marjorie always pushes too far." David took a step closer, his jaw tightening. "You could have knocked on my door. Instead, you cut into my property like I was some stranger who didn't belong here." Marjorie's voice wavered, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Carter. If we start making exceptions, this community falls apart." The taller officer finally spoke. "Sir, we'll need to speak with you separately. This vehicle was part of an active police operation. This woman just interfered with that." The words rippled through the crowd like a sudden gust. "Active police operation." A collective gasp. Murmurs spread fast, half disbelief, half fascination. David's heart sank. Marjorie's face went pale. "What?" she stammered. "That's ridiculous. This is just a neighborhood issue. You can't possibly—" But the officer cut her off, his tone firm. "Ma'am, you need to hand over those cutters and step aside." And just like that, the self-proclaimed enforcer of order stood exposed, surrounded by neighbors, officers, and the man she had wrongly targeted. As David looked around, he saw the faces of people he'd passed countless times. The woman who always waved from her balcony, the couple with the little terrier, the retired teacher from the corner unit. Some looked sympathetic, others looked uneasy, but all of them were watching the moment when authority without empathy finally tripped over itself. For years, David had been patient, quiet, the kind of neighbor who followed every rule and minded his business. But patience only stretches so far, and this time it wasn't just a lock that had been cut. It was the line between fairness and obsession. By the time David realized how many people had gathered, the parking lot looked like an impromptu town square. Neighbors leaned against railings, whispered across balconies, some filming quietly with their phones. Marjorie stood in the middle of it all, her fingers twitching on the bolt cutters. "You don't understand," she said, her voice brittle. "I was protecting the community." "There have been reports," the officer's voice cut her off. "There are no reports that justify damaging private property. You've interfered with a law enforcement operation, ma'am." For a moment, the air hung heavy. Then David spoke, steady but shaking inside. "Protecting the community doesn't mean breaking locks on things you don't own." The words carried through the lot. No one moved. Even the birds seemed to pause. That was when David's neighbor, Carlos Ramirez, stepped forward, arms crossed. "She's been after him for years," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Notes on his door. Emails about where he parks. Always him," a murmur spread. Marjorie's jaw clenched, but she forced a smile. "I enforce rules equally." "Everyone gets the same treatment," Carlos shook his head. "Really?" "Because my son left his bike in the hallway for a week and you didn't say a word." More voices joined in, soft, uncertain, but building. Little pieces of frustration that had been swallowed for years. David didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The neighbors were saying it for him. The officers finished their quick assessment, took photos, and radioed something back to their team. One turned to David. "Sir, we'll need to follow up. Don't move the vehicle until we give the all clear." Then, with a pointed look at Marjorie, "And you, ma'am, should expect contact from our department." When they left, the silence that followed was almost louder than the confrontation itself. Marjorie dropped the bolt cutters, the clatter echoing off the cars. Then she turned and walked briskly toward her unit, chin high, like she could still control the story by outpacing it. But the story was already spreading. By noon, every group chat in Brookhaven Estates was buzzing. Some messages defended her, she was only doing her job. Others condemned her, she embarrassed all of us. And some just asked the question that hung over everyone's mind. If the Jeep was part of a police operation, what exactly was going on? Inside his condo, David sat at his kitchen table staring at his coffee, replaying the scene. He had never wanted drama. He had chosen Brookhaven for peace, for the promise of quiet after long shifts managing deliveries for a local shipping company. He followed every rule because he believed it kept things simple. Now the very system he'd respected had turned against him. Across the complex, Marjorie was doing what she always did, writing. Her fingers flew over her keyboard as she composed a long email titled, "Clarification on this morning's incident." Every sentence sounded official, coded in phrases like community safety and standards enforcement. But there was no apology, only justification. She hit send and sat back, convinced that logic would win. An hour later, replies started rolling in, some supportive, most not. People she'd thought were allies asked sharp questions. One message read simply, "You went too far this time, Marjorie." By evening, David went out to check his Jeep. The new lock he'd installed gleamed under the streetlights. Carlos joined him, holding 2 beers. "Guess she won't be cutting that one," he said with a half-smile. David managed to laugh, though his chest still felt tight. "She'll find another way," he said quietly. They always do, and he was right. Because while the parking lot had returned to calm, Marjorie was sitting at her dining table with stacks of papers spread around her. Old complaints, minutes from meetings, printed bylaws with yellow highlights. To her, this wasn't a defeat, it was a challenge. She wasn't done proving that she was the one keeping Brookhaven from chaos. But the next morning, something new appeared on every resident's doorstep, a notice for an emergency HOA meeting. In bold letters at the top, it read, "Discussion of conduct regarding recent incident in the north parking lot." For the first time in years, the community wasn't rallying around Marjorie. They were preparing to question her. And as neighbors whispered in hallways and by mailboxes, a quiet shift began, the kind that changes everything before anyone realizes it's happening. The day of the meeting was still 2 nights away, but already, the battle lines inside Brookhaven Estates were being drawn. By the next morning, the energy in Brookhaven Estates felt different. Normally, the place had a slow rhythm, sprinklers hissing before sunrise, dogs tugging at leashes, garage doors humming open in sequence. But now every greeting came with a question hiding underneath. Did you hear? Is it true? Are they really calling a meeting? David tried to keep his focus on work, but word of the incident had traveled farther than the gates. A coworker stopped him near the loading dock. Man, you live in that place with the lady and the bolt cutters, right? The comment stung. He forced a small smile and kept walking. That night he came home to find a paper taped to his door. Another memo from the HOA, this one signed not by Marjorie but by Robert Lang, the association president. It confirmed the emergency meeting and invited residents to share concerns about recent conduct inconsistent with the spirit of community. It didn't name her, but everyone knew who it was about. Across the courtyard, Marjorie's lights burned late. She was pacing the length of her living room, phone pressed to her ear. Robert's overreacting, she said. He's letting gossip dictate policy. Someone has to remind him of procedure. Whoever she was talking to didn't offer much sympathy. When the call ended, she stood for a long time staring at her reflection in the sliding glass door. The woman staring back looked tired, not triumphant. The day before the meeting, David's neighbor Lena Parker knocked on his door carrying a small folder. Inside were copies of violation letters Marjorie had sent her, over planters, curtains, and even the color of her mailbox flag. "You're not alone," she said. "She's been doing this to half of us. Maybe now people will finally speak up." David didn't want to be the center of anything, but he could see the determination in Lena's eyes. "You're planning to talk at the meeting?" he asked. She nodded. "If I don't, she'll spin it her way again." The evening of the meeting, the community room filled to capacity. Folding chairs lined the walls, the air thick with tension and the hum of conversation. Some neighbors came out of curiosity, others out of anger or loyalty. David took a seat near the back, flanked by Carlos and Lena. Marjorie entered last, holding a thick binder to her chest. She wore her usual neat blazer, though her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her papers at the front table. Robert called the room to order, his voice firm but tired. "We're here tonight because our community has reached a crossroads," he began. "We need to decide what kind of neighborhood we want to be." A ripple went through the crowd as Lena stood first. "For years we've been treated like children," she said. "Letters, warnings, fines for tiny things. And when people tried to question it, we were ignored." She lifted the folder. "I have 16 letters from the same person. I replaced my doormat 3 times because it wasn't neutral enough. That's not keeping order. That's control." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Marjorie's smile tightened. "I was following the bylaws," she said. "If people don't like structure, maybe they shouldn't live in a managed community." Carlos rose next. "Structure's one thing. Harassment's another. You crossed a line when you brought bolt cutters into it." Robert raised a hand for quiet. "Let's keep this respectful." He turned to David. "Would you like to speak?" Every eye in the room turned. David stood slowly, feeling the weight of it all. The humiliation, the anger, the endless small indignities. He didn't raise his voice. "I've lived here 7 years. Paid my dues. Never caused trouble. Saturday morning I came outside and found a crowd watching someone cut through my lock because she decided my car didn't belong. She never asked. She never checked. She just assumed." He paused. "If that's what we call community enforcement, then maybe the problem isn't the rules. Maybe it's who we trust to enforce them." The silence that followed was long and full. Then from the back someone clapped once. Another joined, then half the room. Marjorie slammed her binder shut. "You're all making a spectacle out of nothing. Without people like me, this place would fall apart." Robert's voice was steady. "It's already falling apart, Marjorie. Just not the way you think." He looked around the room. "We'll take a vote on her position." Majority rules, hands went up. Row after row, more than enough. Marjorie's face went white. She gathered her things and walked out without another word. The door closed hard behind her, leaving only the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. People exhaled at once. Conversations broke out in low tones. Some looked relieved, others uneasy, but the tension had broken. Robert leaned on the table, rubbing his temples. "Let's make sure this place starts talking to each other again," he said quietly. Outside, the night was cool and still. David stood for a long time in the courtyard, listening to the crickets, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. But he knew it wasn't over. Rumors spread faster than facts, and Marjorie was not the kind to accept defeat quietly. Inside her condo, lights still glowed. The blinds were drawn, the phone screen lit her face. She wasn't finished. Not yet. The night after the meeting, rain swept across Brookhaven Estates, turning the streets into silver ribbons under the streetlights. David sat by his window, watching droplets race down the glass. The quiet felt unfamiliar. No angry emails, no new warnings, no cold stares from across the parking lot. Yet beneath that calm, something restless lingered. The next morning, he saw the change. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now stopped to chat. Lena waved from the walkway. Carlos fixed the broken mailbox stand without being asked. For the first time in years, the place actually felt like a neighborhood instead of a rulebook. But inside Unit 14B, Marjorie was drafting something new. A formal letter, 3 pages long, addressed to her attorney. The headline read, "Potential defamation and wrongful removal from office." She believed she was the victim now, the misunderstood guardian of order surrounded by ungrateful residents. She told herself she was right. She always had been. Later that day, she called the county police department, demanding to speak to a supervisor about the officers who mishandled a community. Misunderstanding. The receptionist transferred her twice. Before someone explained the obvious, she had interfered with a lawful investigation, and her actions were documented. Marjorie hung up mid-sentence, staring at her reflection in the blank computer screen. Her own certainty looked back at her like armor starting to crack. Meanwhile, David received a visit from one of the same officers who'd been there that morning. His name tag read Detective Haynes. He stood in the doorway, calm but serious. "We've concluded our report," he said. The Jeep was being used as part of a surveillance setup for a theft ring in the area. Her interference could have exposed the operation. "We're not pressing full charges, but there will be an official warning on record." David nodded, unsure what to feel. "Will she know about it?" "She'll know," Haynes said, "and she should count herself lucky." After the detective left, David sat for a long time holding his coffee, the steam curling upward like a thought he couldn't quite catch. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. It was closure edged with fatigue. By evening, another email arrived in everyone's inbox, this time from Robert Lang, calm and to the point. It confirmed that Marjorie Keller was permanently removed from the HOA board and that new elections would take place soon. The message ended with a line that struck David more than he expected. "Let's rebuild trust, starting now." Over the next few weeks, Brookhaven seemed to breathe again. The bulletin boards, once filled with warnings, now held notices for potlucks and game nights. Kids played soccer in the courtyard without someone timing them. Lena started a small gardening club. Carlos organized a weekend barbecue. One Saturday afternoon, as David returned from work, he noticed something near his Jeep, a small note tucked under the windshield wiper. For a moment, his heart tightened, memories flashing back to Marjorie's old violation slips. But when he unfolded it, he found a short message written in neat handwriting. "Glad to see the Jeep still around. Welcome back to peace." It was signed simply, "A Neighbor." He smiled for the first time in weeks, yet even peace has its echoes. Across town, in a law office off Central Avenue, Marjorie sat stiffly across from her attorney, explaining why she wanted to pursue action. The attorney listened patiently, taking notes, then finally looked up. "Ms. Keller, with respect, this isn't defamation. You broke a lock on private property under active police surveillance. You'd risk more trouble by pushing it." Marjorie's face reddened. "So that's it? I just walk away?" "That's usually how lessons work," the attorney said gently. When she left the office, the city felt bigger than she remembered, and for once she didn't have anyone to instruct or correct. The certainty she'd lived by all those years had turned into a quiet question she couldn't answer. Back in Brookhaven, the evening light spilled across driveways and trimmed lawns. David stood beside his Jeep, running a hand over the new lock, its metal cool and solid. He thought about how a simple act of arrogance had almost turned his life upside down, and how standing his ground, calmly and firmly, had changed everything. The next week, The residents gathered again, not for confrontation this time, but for renewal. They voted for a new board. They talked about how to handle disputes face to face before they became battles. For the first time, people listened to each other. When the meeting ended, Robert turned to David. "You ever think about joining the board?" "We could use someone with your patience," David laughed softly. "I think I've had enough politics for one lifetime." But later that night, as he walked through the quiet parking lot, he realized something. Change didn't come from rules or titles. It came from people refusing to stay silent when silence became injustice. That thought stayed with him long after the lights in the condos went dark, long after the sound of crickets faded. He knew Brookhaven would never be perfect, but for the first time it felt honest. And somewhere behind closed doors miles away, Marjorie Keller finally stopped writing letters. Weeks passed and the rhythm of Brookhaven Estate settled into something softer, something almost unfamiliar. The air no longer carried tension. It carried laughter and the hum of small talk that had been missing for too long. The lawns looked the same, the buildings unchanged, yet the place itself felt entirely new. David began to notice the little things again. The smell of jasmine from Lena's garden, the way the sunset hit the row of mailboxes at dusk. Life was ordinary, steady, the way it should have always been. But in the quiet corners of his mind, he knew stories like Marjorie's rarely ended without one final ripple. That ripple came one evening when he received a letter marked with the county seal. Inside was a short statement from the police department, confirming that the investigation tied to his Jeep had been closed successfully. The theft ring had been caught. A handwritten note from Detective Haynes was attached. "Thanks for your patience, Mr. Carter. Sometimes doing nothing is the hardest thing to do right." David set the letter down and exhaled. The entire ordeal, from the grinding sound of those bolt cutters to the heated meeting, had changed the way he saw fairness. Justice hadn't come from shouting. It had come from persistence. Later that night, there was a soft knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Lena holding a tray of homemade empanadas and a grin that could light up a room. "We're celebrating in the courtyard," she said. "You're not skipping it." Outside, the whole community had gathered under string lights draped between palm trees. Music floated through the air. Laughter spilled over plates of food, and for once there were no hidden divides. Robert stood near the grill, apron on, flipping burgers while Carlos tried to teach a group of kids to juggle lemons. When David joined them, the conversation hushed for a second, not in awkwardness but in recognition. This was the man who had stood in that same courtyard weeks earlier, calm while chaos swirled around him. Someone handed him a plate, and slowly the noise returned, louder and warmer. As the evening went on, talk drifted to the future of the HOA. People tossed out ideas about new committees, shared gardens, even a book exchange. Every suggestion began with we instead of they. That one small change said everything. When the crowd started to thin, Robert walked over, wiping his hands on a napkin.
"You ever think we'd get here?"
he asked. David smiled. "Honestly, I didn't think we'd make it through that meeting alive." Robert chuckled, then grew serious. "What happened here? What you started? It reminded people that rules mean nothing if they don't have respect behind them." David didn't respond right away. He looked around instead, at Lena laughing with her husband, at Carlos chasing his son through the grass, at the faint glow of porch lights flickering on across the complex. For the first time in years, Brookhaven felt like home. A few weeks later, news spread quietly that Marjorie Keller had sold her condo. No one saw the moving truck arrive, only the empty windows left behind. Some said she'd gone to live with her sister upstate. Others said she'd moved into a community with no HOA at all. Either way, no one wished her ill. In the end, she had given them a lesson no one else could have taught. That weekend, David took a drive along the coast. The Jeep's engine purred like it always had, steady and sure. The road unwound before him in long, bright stretches, and for the first time he didn't feel the weight of other people's judgment pressing down. He thought about his parents, about the simple advice they'd given him. Pick your battles. But when the right one finds you, stand your ground. As the sun sank behind the horizon, painting the water gold, he realized what that meant now. It wasn't about fighting to win. It was about fighting to be seen, to remind people that respect was not a privilege handed down by rules. It was a promise kept between neighbors. Back at Brookhaven that night, the courtyard was quiet again. The only sound was the soft creak of palm leaves and the steady hum of crickets. David parked his Jeep in its usual spot, snapped the new lock into place, and paused. For a moment, he just stood there feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The lock gleamed under the lamplight, a small symbol of something larger. Not fear, not caution, but peace earned through persistence. He turned toward his building, took a slow breath, and smiled to himself. The storm that had divided them was gone. What remained was stronger than any rule or regulation, an understanding that fairness isn't enforced by power, but by people who care enough to speak when it matters. And as the lights went out across the complex one by one, Brookhaven Estates exhaled into stillness. The kind that comes only after a fight worth having, the kind that says the lesson has finally sunk in.